Hello, everyone. I am the Jackbound Sleep Story, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The cabin was supposed to be our escape, instead, it became our prison. I remember the excitement in my kids' eyes as we pulled up to the secluded rental nestled deep in the pine-scented forest. My wife, Sarah, squeezed my hand and smiled. "This is exactly what we needed, Jack," she said, her voice filled with relief. After months of stress at work and the kids' hectic school schedules, we were all ready for a week of peace and quiet. The cabin was everything the pictures promised, rustic charm with modern amenities. Warm, knotty pine walls welcomed us inside, and a stone fireplace dominated the cozy living room. Large windows offered breathtaking views of the surrounding wilderness. As I lugged our bags inside, our kids, Ethan and Lily, raced around exploring every nook and cranny of our temporary home. Their laughter echoed through the rooms, a sound I hadn't heard enough lately. "Dad, can we go explore outside?" Ethan, our 12-year-old, was already by the back door, practically vibrating with energy. I glanced at Sarah, who nodded. "Sure, but stay close to the cabin and be back in an hour for dinner." The smell of Sarah's famous chili filled the air as I settled into an armchair with a book I'd been meaning to read for months. The quiet was blissful, broken only by the occasional bird call or the rustle of wind through the trees. An hour passed. Then two. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. A knot of worry formed in my stomach. "Sarah, the kids should have been back by now," I said, setting my book aside. She frowned, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You're right. Can you go check on them? Dinner's almost ready." I stepped out onto the back porch, the wood creaking beneath my feet. "Ethan, Lily. Time to come in." My voice echoed through the trees, but no response came. The forest suddenly seemed much darker, the shadows deeper and more menacing. I jogged down the steps, leaves crunching under my feet. "Kids, this isn't funny. Come on out." A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, and I whirled around. "Ethan? Lily?" Nothing. The knot in my stomach tightened. I pulled out my phone, cursing when I saw no signal. Of course, we were miles from the nearest cell tower. I ran back to the cabin. "Sarah, the kids aren't answering. I'm going to look for them." Her face paled. "I'll come with you." We grabbed flashlights and jackets, then plunged into the darkening forest. Our beams of light cut through the gloom, illuminating gnarled tree trunks and dense underbrush. "Ethan! Lily!" We called their names until our throats were raw, but the forest remained eerily silent. An hour passed, maybe more. We'd wandered far from the cabin, and a chill seeped into my bones that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. "Jack," Sarah's voice quavered, "what if?" "No," I cut her off. "They're fine. They have to be." A rustling in the bushes nearby made us both freeze. Our flashlight beams converged on the spot, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the light. But then, nothing. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered. I nodded, my mouth dry. "Let's head back to the cabin. Maybe they returned while we were out here." We retraced our steps, but the trees all looked the same in the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized we were lost. "Jack," Sarah's voice was tight with fear, "where's the cabin?" Before I could answer, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It was Lily's voice. We ran toward the sound, branches whipping at our faces. Another scream, closer this time, then Ethan's voice, "Dad! Mom! Help!" We burst into a small clearing, our flashlights illuminating a scene from a nightmare. Ethan and Lily huddled together at the base of a massive oak tree, their eyes wide with terror. Surrounding them, closing in, were shapes, dark, hunched figures that seemed to melt into the shadows. "Get away from them!" I yelled, charging forward. The shapes retreated into the darkness, but I could still feel their presence, watching us from just beyond the reach of our lights. I scooped Lily into my arms while Sarah grabbed Ethan's hand. Are you okay? What happened? Lily buried her face in my shoulder, sobbing. Ethan's voice shook as he spoke. We got lost. It got dark so fast, and then we saw them. Them? Sarah asked. Ethan nodded, his face pale. They'd been following us, watching us. We tried to find our way back, but they kept herding us deeper into the woods. A twig snapped nearby, and we all jumped. We need to get back to the cabin, I said, my voice firm. Now. We stumbled through the forest, the children between us. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. The shapes kept pace with us, always just out of sight but undeniably there. After what felt like hours, we finally saw the warm glow of the cabin's porchlight through the trees. We ran the last 100 yards, not stopping until we were inside with the door locked behind us. Sarah immediately checked the kids for injuries while I made sure every window and door was secure. As I drew the curtains in the living room, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the trees, a dark figure, standing unnaturally still, watching the cabin. I quickly closed the curtain, my hand shaking. Jack, Sarah's voice pulled me back. The kids are okay. No injuries, just scared. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. Good. That's good. We settled the kids on the couch, wrapping them in blankets. Ethan's eyes darted to every window while Lily clung to her mother, whimpering softly. What were those things? Sarah whispered to me. I shook my head. I don't know. But we're safe now. We'll leave first thing in the morning. A loud thump on the roof made us all jump, then another, and another. It sounded like something, or multiple somethings, were walking around up there. Lily started crying again, and Ethan's face went even paler. They found us, he whispered. I grabbed the fireplace poker, holding it like a weapon. Sarah, take the kids to the bedroom. Lock the door and don't come out until I say it's safe. She nodded, ushering the children down the hallway. I heard the click of the lock and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The thumps on the roof continued, now accompanied by scratching sounds at the windows. I moved from room to room, checking each one, the poker gripped tightly in my sweating hands. In the kitchen, a window shattered. I ran in, just in time to see a dark, spindly arm reaching through the broken glass. Without thinking, I swung the poker, connecting with something solid. There was an inhuman shriek, and the arm withdrew. More windows broke. Shadows moved just outside, their forms indistinct but unmistakably not human. I ran from room to room, swinging the poker at anything that tried to get in, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The assault seemed to last for hours. By the time the sun began to rise, every window in the cabin was broken, the floors covered in glass and leaves blown in by the wind. But somehow, miraculously, nothing had gotten inside. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, the attack stopped. I cautiously approached a window, peering out into the forest. Nothing moved. The woods looked peaceful, innocent in the morning light. I unlocked the bedroom door. Sarah and the kids were huddled together on the bed, their eyes wide and fearful. Is it over? Sarah asked. I nodded, exhausted. I think so. Come on. We're leaving now. We threw our belongings haphazardly into our bags and ran to the car. As I started the engine, I looked back at the cabin one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw a face in one of the broken windows, pale, elongated, with two large eyes. But then we were driving away, tires kicking up gravel. We didn't speak much on the long drive home, each lost in our own thoughts. The kids fell asleep in the back seat, the ordeal finally catching up with them. Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand. What do we tell people? She asked quietly. I sighed, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The truth. That the woods aren't as empty as we think. That there are things out there we can't explain. I shook my head. They'd think we were crazy. She nodded, understanding. So we say nothing. We say nothing, I agreed. But as we drove back toward civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd brushed up against something ancient and unknowable. Something that had always been there, hiding in the shadows of the forest, watching and waiting. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that our quiet family vacation had changed us forever. The woods may be behind us, but the memory of those dark shapes, those inhuman eyes, would haunt us for the rest of our lives. The silver tray gleamed in the dim hallway light, but its contents made my blood run cold. I never ordered room service, especially not this. I checked into the Blackwood Hotel earlier that evening, exhausted from a long day of meetings. The lobby was grand, all polished marble and crystal chandeliers, but there was something off about it. Maybe it was the slightly faded carpet or the way the receptionist's smile never quite reached her eyes. "Enjoy your stay, Miss Parker," she'd said, handing me the keycard. Was it my imagination, or did her fingers linger a moment too long? My room was on the 13th floor. Of course, it was. I'm not usually superstitious, but as the elevator climbed, each floor number lighting up in sequence, I felt a growing sense of unease. The room itself was nice enough, spacious, with a king-sized bed and a view of the city skyline. I set my laptop on the desk, intending to get some work done before bed. That's when I noticed the first strange thing, a single red rose in a vase on the nightstand. I hadn't ordered flowers. I picked up the phone to call the front desk, but the line was dead. Odd. I reached for my cell phone instead, only to find I had no signal. Frustrating, but not entirely unusual in an old building like this. Shrugging it off, I decided to take a quick shower before diving into my work. The bathroom was all gleaming white tile and fluffy towels, but the mirror above the sink was slightly tarnished around the edges. As I turned on the shower, the pipes groaned ominously before sputtering to life. The hot water helped ease some of the tension from my shoulders, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to rationalize it, new place, long day, too much coffee, but the nagging sensation persisted. Wrapped in a plush hotel robe, I settled at the desk and opened my laptop. The Wi-Fi was painfully slow, each page taking ages to load. I was in the middle of answering an email when I heard it, a soft knock at the door. I froze, fingers hovering over the keyboard. It was nearly midnight. Who could be knocking? "Room service," a muffled voice called out. My brow furrowed. I hadn't ordered anything. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake," I called back. "I didn't order room service." Silence. Then another knock, more insistent this time. Sighing, I got up and approached the door. The peephole showed an empty hallway. Great, I thought, some kid playing pranks. But when I opened the door, I found myself face to face with a silver tray. And that's where I am now, staring at its contents with growing horror. Because on that tray is a collection of items that have no business being here. A worn teddy bear I'd lost when I was 8, a mixtape an ex-boyfriend made for me in college, a pair of earrings my grandmother left me in her will. Earrings that should be locked away in my apartment back home. My hands shake as I lift the tray and bring it into the room. There's a note tucked underneath the bear. With trembling fingers, I unfold it. "Welcome back, Emily. We've been waiting for you, asterisk asterisk." The door slams shut behind me, making me jump. I whirl around, but there's no one there, just the empty hallway visible through the peephole. My heart races as I try to make sense of what's happening. How did these things get here? Who brought them? And what did that note mean? Welcome back? I've never stayed at this hotel before. I grab my phone again, desperately trying to get a signal. Nothing. The room suddenly feels smaller, the air thick and oppressive. I need to get out of here. I throw on some clothes and shove my feet into my shoes, not bothering with the laces. As I reach for the door handle, the lights flicker once, twice, and then go out completely. For a moment, I'm plunged into total darkness. Then, slowly, a faint green glow emanates from the items on the tray. The teddy bear's eyes seem to follow me as I back away, my back hitting the wall. A low hum fills the air, growing louder by the second. It's coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The mirror in the bathroom begins to rattle in its frame. I fumble for the door handle, my sweaty palm slipping on the cool metal. It won't turn. Help! I scream, pounding on the door. Somebody help me! But my cries are drowned out by the intensifying hum. The floor beneath my feet begins to vibrate. Pictures fall from the walls, shattering on the carpet. And then, as suddenly as it began, everything stops. The lights flicker back to life, revealing a room in disarray. But the tray and its impossible contents are gone. I slump to the floor, my back against the door, trying to catch my breath. What just happened? Am I losing my mind? A new sound breaks the silence, the cheerful ping of an arriving email. My laptop, somehow undisturbed on the desk, glows with an unread message. On shaky legs, I approach it. The email is from an address I don't recognize, Blackwood Hotel Eternal Sea. The subject line reads, "Your stay with us." With a trembling hand, I click it open. Dear Miss Parker, we hope you're enjoying your return to the Blackwood Hotel. As a valued guest, we've taken the liberty of providing some mementos of your previous stays with us. Your room has been specially prepared to enhance your experience. We do hope you'll join us for the duration of your visit this time. Checking out early can be problematic. Sweet dreams. The management ***. Days. I've never been here before, have I? A knock at the door makes me jump. Housekeeping, a cheery voice calls out. I approach cautiously, peering through the peephole. An older woman in a maid's uniform smiles back at me, her cart visible behind her. Against my better judgment, I open the door a crack. I'm sorry, I didn't request housekeeping. The maid's smile never wavers. Oh, but dear, you always do. Every time you stay with us. A chill runs down my spine. I've never stayed here before, I insist, my voice quavering. She laughs, a sound like brittle leaves crunching underfoot. Of course, you have, Miss Parker. You've been our guest many, many times. You just never remember. Before I can respond, she pushes past me into the room. I stumble back, watching in stunned silence as she begins to tidy up the mess from earlier. Now, she tuts, picking up a fallen picture frame. We can't have you making such a fuss. It upsets the other guests. Other guests? I manage to croak out. What other guests? I haven't seen anyone else. The maid pauses, turning to face me with that same unchanging smile. Oh, they're here. They're always here. Just like you. She resumes her cleaning, humming softly to herself. I watch, paralyzed, as she moves around the room with practiced efficiency. When she's done, it's as if nothing had ever happened. The room is pristine, every item in its place. There we are, she says, satisfied. All better now. You should get some rest, dear. Tomorrow is always a big day here at the Blackwood. As she wheels her cart toward the door, a thought strikes me. Wait, I call out. What did you mean, I never remember? What's going on here? The maid pauses in the doorway, her back to me. When she speaks, her voice has lost its cheery tone, replaced by something ancient and cold. Time works differently here, Miss Parker. For some, it's a moment. For others, an eternity. But for you, well, you're special. You keep coming back. Over and over. Always forgetting, always reliving. It's quite fascinating, really. She turns to face me, and I gasp. Her eyes are completely black, like empty voids. Sleep now, she says softly. When you wake, it will all begin again. And who knows? Maybe this time you'll finally remember. The door closes behind her with a soft click. I rush to open it, but it's locked once more. The room spins around me as a wave of dizziness hits. I stumble to the bed, my limbs suddenly heavy. As my eyes close against my will, the last thing I see is the vase on the nightstand. A fresh red rose has appeared, its petals gleaming in the low light. In the morning, I'll wake up in my own bed, in my own apartment. I'll go about my day, attend my meetings, and eventually check into the Blackwood Hotel, tired from a long day of travel. The receptionist will smile, not quite reaching her eyes, and say, "Enjoy your stay, Miss Parker." And it will all begin again. The island wasn't on any map, but it was all I could think about. What started as a dream vacation quickly became a nightmare we couldn't escape. My wife, Lisa, and I had been planning this trip for months. 2 weeks in paradise, just the two of us, to celebrate our 5th anniversary. The brochure promised crystal clear waters, pristine beaches, and the ultimate in relaxation. What it didn't mention was the secrets lurking just offshore. We arrived at our resort on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. The view from our beachfront bungalow was breathtaking, an endless expanse of turquoise water stretching to the horizon. That first evening, as we sipped cocktails on our private deck, I noticed a small dark shape in the distance. "Hey, Lisa," I said, pointing. "Is that an island out there?" She squinted, following my gaze. "Ha! I don't remember seeing that on the map. Maybe it's just a shadow." But it wasn't a shadow. As the sun dipped lower, casting a warm golden glow across the water, I could clearly make out the silhouette of an island, its jagged outline stark against the fading light. "We should ask about it tomorrow," Lisa suggested, settling back into her chair. "Maybe there's a day trip or something." I nodded, but something about the island's presence unsettled me. It seemed to loom larger than its size suggested, a dark blot on our perfect tropical landscape. The next morning, I approached the front desk while Lisa was still getting ready for breakfast. The clerk, a young local woman named Amy, greeted me with a bright smile. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. How are you enjoying your stay so far?" "It's beautiful," I replied. "Actually, I had a question. That island offshore, is it open to visitors?" Amy's smile faltered for just a moment. "Island? I'm sorry, sir, but there are no islands within viewing distance of the resort." I frowned. "But I can see it from our bungalow. It's right there, maybe a few miles out." She shook her head, her expression now carefully neutral. "I assure you, Mr. Thompson, there is no island. Perhaps you saw a passing ship or a cloud formation." I wanted to argue, but something in her tone made me hold back. Instead, I thanked her and walked away, more confused than ever. Over breakfast, I told Lisa about the strange conversation. She looked concerned. "That's weird," she said, stirring her coffee absently. "Why would she deny it? We can both clearly see it." We spent the morning on the beach, but I couldn't relax. My eyes kept drifting to the island, which seemed even more prominent in the bright daylight. Its shoreline was ringed with dense vegetation, and I could swear I saw movement among the trees. As the day wore on, I noticed other guests pointing and whispering about the island, but whenever anyone approached a staff member about it, they received the same denial we had. That night, unable to sleep, I stood on our deck, staring out at the dark shape on the horizon. A faint light flickered among the trees, there one moment and gone the next. My skin prickled with goosebumps despite the warm night air. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air. I watched in disbelief as a small boat emerged from the shadows of the island, its running lights off. It sped toward the resort, disappearing from view as it neared the shore. Heart pounding, I shook Lisa awake. "Someone just came from the island," I whispered urgently. "We need to find out what's going on." She blinked at me sleepily. "What, Jack? It's the middle of the night. You're probably just seeing things." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I pulled on some clothes and slipped out of the bungalow, ignoring Lisa's protests. The resort was eerily quiet as I made my way toward the beach. As I rounded a corner, I saw a group of people unloading crates from a small boat. They worked quickly and silently, their faces hidden in the shadows. I ducked behind a palm tree, my heart racing. What was in those crates? Drugs? Weapons? My mind spun with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. A twig snapped beneath my foot, and one of the figures turned sharply in my direction. I held my breath, pressing myself against the rough bark of the tree. "Hey," a voice called out. "Who's there?" I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in our bungalow, gasping for air. Lisa sat up in bed, her eyes wide with concern. Jack, what happened? I told her everything I'd seen, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. She listened in stunned silence, her face growing paler by the second. We need to leave, she said finally. First thing in the morning. This isn't safe. I nodded, relieved she believed me. We spent the rest of the night packing our bags, jumping at every sound outside. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, we wheeled our suitcases to the front desk. Amy was there again, her smile as bright and false as ever. Checking out early, she asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp. Family emergency, Lisa lied smoothly. We need to get home right away. Amy's fingers flew over the keyboard. I'm so sorry to hear that. Let me just pull up your reservation. She frowned at the screen. Oh dear, it seems there's a problem with your booking. The system won't let me check you out. My stomach dropped. What do you mean, it won't let you? We're leaving now. Amy's smile never wavered. I understand, sir, but I'm afraid that's not possible. Your stay with us isn't over yet. A cold feeling crept up my spine. I grabbed Lisa's hand and turned to leave, but two large men in resort uniforms blocked our path. Please, Amy said, her voice suddenly hard, return to your bungalow. We'll sort this out later. The next few days were a blur of fear and confusion. We were prisoners in paradise, our every move watched. Other guests seemed oblivious to our plight, laughing and playing on the beach as if nothing was wrong. Each night, I watched the boat make its clandestine journey from the island. Once, I saw a group of people being escorted onto it, looking dazed and compliant. They never returned. We tried to warn other guests, but no one believed us. They all insisted there was no island, no boat, no danger. It was as if the entire resort was under some kind of spell. On our fifth night of captivity, Lisa shook me awake. Jack, she whispered urgently. Look. I followed her gaze to the window. A dense fog had rolled in, obscuring everything beyond our bungalow. But in the distance, a light pulsed rhythmically. It was coming from the island. It's a signal, I realized. They're calling the boat. Lisa's eyes were wide with fear and determination. This might be our only chance, she said. We have to try to escape. Heart pounding, we gathered what we could carry and slipped out into the fog. The resort was eerily silent, the usual sounds of nighttime strangely absent. We made our way to the beach, the damp sand muffling our footsteps. The small dock where I'd seen the boat land was deserted. We crouched behind some crates, waiting. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then, finally, we heard it, the low hum of an approaching engine. The boat materialized out of the fog, a dark shape against the gray backdrop. As it bumped against the dock, we tensed, ready to make our move. But before we could, a group of resort staff appeared, led by Amy. They began unloading more crates, working with practiced efficiency. Now, Lisa whispered, tugging my arm. We darted from our hiding place, sprinting down the dock. Shouts of alarm erupted behind us, but we didn't look back. We leapt onto the boat just as it started to pull away. The captain, a grizzled man with hard eyes, turned to us in shock. What the? I didn't let him finish. Adrenaline pumping, I tackled him, wrestling for control of the wheel. Lisa grabbed a nearby rope, quickly binding the man's hands and feet. Breathing heavily, I took the wheel, steering us into the fog. Behind us, angry voices faded into the distance. As we neared the island, its true nature became horrifyingly clear. What we had thought was dense vegetation was actually a jumble of buildings and equipment, carefully camouflaged. Lights blazed from windows, and figures moved about with purpose. My God, Lisa breathed. What is this place? We never got the chance to find out. As we approached the shoreline, searchlights suddenly blazed to life, blinding us. Alarms blared, and I could hear the sound of more boats approaching. We have to go back, I said, my voice shaking. We can't dock here. Lisa nodded, her face pale but resolute. I spun the wheel, turning us back toward the open sea. We sped past the other boats, their occupants shouting and gesturing wildly. For hours, we pushed the little vessel to its limits, always staying just ahead of our pursuers. As dawn broke, we finally spotted another island in the distance, a real one this time, with a bustling port and normal-looking buildings. We docked among a cluster of fishing boats, our legs shaky as we set foot on solid ground. The local police were skeptical of our story at first, but the boat's captain, once untied, corroborated enough of it to launch an investigation. Weeks later, we learned the truth. The resort was a front for a massive human trafficking operation. The island served as a processing center where people were sorted and shipped off to buyers around the world. Hundreds of victims were rescued, and a network of corrupt officials and business owners was exposed. Lisa and I returned home shaken but grateful to be alive. We never took another tropical vacation. Some paradises, we learned, are better left unexplored. I never thought a smile could be so terrifying until I met Mrs. Anderson. Her friendly wave became the herald of my nightmares, and her constant presence turned our dream home into a prison of paranoia. It all started the day we moved in. The moving truck had just pulled away, leaving boxes strewn across our new front lawn. I was struggling with a particularly heavy one when I heard a cheerful voice behind me. "Welcome to the neighborhood." I turned to see a woman in her 60s, impeccably dressed, with a plate of cookies in her hands. Her smile was wide, almost too wide, stretching across her face in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Margaret Anderson," she said, extending the plate. "I live next door. Thought you might need a little pick-me-up after all that heavy lifting." "Thanks," I said, taking a cookie. "I'm Sarah. My husband, Tom, and our kids are inside somewhere, probably arguing about where to put the couch." Mrs. Anderson's eyes lit up. "Oh, you have children? How wonderful. I do so love the sound of little ones playing." Something in her tone made me pause mid-bite. There was an intensity to her words that seemed out of place, but I brushed it off as neighborly enthusiasm and invited her in for a tour. As we walked through the house, Mrs. Anderson commented on everything: the paint colors, the layout, even the view from each window. It was like she was cataloging every detail. When we reached the kids' rooms, she lingered, running her hand over the doorframes with an almost reverent touch. "Such lovely spaces for growing minds," she murmured. "You must be so proud." I nodded, suddenly eager to end the tour. "Well, we should probably get back to unpacking. Thanks again for the cookies." Mrs. Anderson's smile never wavered. "Of course, dear. Don't hesitate to ask if you need anything. I'm always watching, I'm always around to help." As I watched her walk back to her house, a chill ran down my spine despite the warm summer air. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of unpacking, settling in, and starting new routines. Mrs. Anderson was a constant presence, always popping by with baked goods or a helpful suggestion about lawn care or local schools. At first, I appreciated her friendliness, but soon her visits began to feel less like neighborly gestures and more like inspections. One afternoon, I was in the backyard with my daughter, Emma, helping her practice cartwheels. I heard the distinct sound of a camera shutter and looked up to see Mrs. Anderson lowering her phone. "Oh, don't mind me," she called out, waving from her upstairs window. "I just love capturing special moments. You two look so adorable together." I forced a smile and waved back, but inside, my stomach churned. Why was she photographing us? And how long had she been watching? That night, I mentioned it to Tom. He laughed it off, saying she was probably just a lonely old woman who missed having kids around. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had taken root in my gut. As days turned into weeks, Mrs. Anderson's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She seemed to know our schedules better than we did, often appearing just as we were leaving for work or school. Once, I came home to find her in our backyard, pruning our rose bushes without invitation. "I hope you don't mind," she said, her ever-present smile firmly in place. I noticed they needed a little TLC, and I just couldn't help myself. I wanted to be angry, to tell her to stay off our property, but something in her eyes stopped me. There was a hunger there, a desperate need that made me hesitate. "That's very kind of you," I managed to say. "But please, in the future, ask before coming onto our property." Her smile flickered for just a moment, a flash of something dark crossing her face. Then it was gone, replaced by her usual cheerful expression. "Of course, dear. I wouldn't want to overstep." But she did overstep. Again and again. She showed up at Emma's soccer game, cheering louder than any of the parents. She appeared at the grocery store, coincidentally shopping at the same time as me. She even started leaving voicemails with detailed weather reports, just in case we forgot to check the forecast. The breaking point came on a crisp October evening. Tom and I were enjoying a rare night out, leaving the kids with a babysitter. We returned home to find Mrs. Anderson sitting on our porch, a look of disapproval on her face. "I saw that young girl you left in charge," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "She had her boyfriend over. They were very inappropriate." My blood ran cold. How did she know? Had she been watching our house the entire time we were gone? Tom, usually the calm one, finally snapped. "Mrs. Anderson, this has to stop. You can't keep spying on us. We appreciate your concern, but it's becoming intrusive." For a moment, Mrs. Anderson's facade cracked. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of such raw pain and loneliness that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "I'm just trying to help," she whispered. "To keep you safe. To be part of." She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. Tom softened slightly. "We understand you might be lonely, but this isn't the way to make friends. You need to respect our privacy." Mrs. Anderson stood up slowly, her shoulders hunched. "You don't understand," she said, her voice suddenly cold. "None of you ever understand." She walked away, disappearing into the darkness of her own home. Tom and I exchanged worried glances before hurrying inside to check on the kids. The next morning, Mrs. Anderson's house was quiet. No lights. No movement. Days passed, and we saw no sign of her. Part of me was relieved, but another part worried, had we been too harsh? A week later, a police car pulled up in front of her house. Curious, I wandered over to where a small group of neighbors had gathered. "What's going on?" I asked. A woman I recognized from down the street leaned in, her voice low. "They found Mrs. Anderson. She took her own life." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Mrs. Anderson, dead? Despite everything, I felt a pang of guilt. Had our confrontation pushed her over the edge? As the police conducted their investigation, more details emerged. Mrs. Anderson had lost her husband and young daughter in a car accident decades ago. She'd never fully recovered, becoming increasingly isolated and fixated on the families around her. In her house, they found dozens of photo albums filled with pictures of neighborhood children, including ours. There were journals detailing our daily routines, our conversations, even what we ate for dinner. It was a shrine to the family life she'd lost and desperately wanted to reclaim. The most chilling discovery was in her basement, a room meticulously decorated to match Emma's bedroom in our house, right down to the stuffed animals on the bed. On the wall, a calendar with a date circled in red, the day after we'd confronted her on our porch. The police believed she had been planning to take Emma, to recreate the family she'd lost. Our argument had derailed her plans, leading to her tragic decision. In the days that followed, our quiet suburb was a whirlwind of police interviews, concerned neighbors, and news vans. We installed a security system, added extra locks to the doors and windows. But no alarm could protect us from the guilt and fear that now permeated our once happy home. Months have passed, and life has slowly returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. Mrs. Anderson's house stands empty, a silent reminder of the tragedy that unfolded. Sometimes I catch myself glancing at her windows, half expecting to see her watching us. The kids no longer play in the front yard, and I double-check the locks every night. We've talked about moving, starting fresh somewhere new. But part of me wonders, would it really make a difference? The world suddenly seems full of Mrs. Andersons, their smiles hiding desperate loneliness and dangerous obsessions. Every friendly wave from a neighbor now carries a hint of suspicion. Every act of kindness is scrutinized for ulterior motives. Our dream home has become a fortress, and trust feels like a luxury we can no longer afford. As I sit on our porch, watching the sunset over our quiet street, I can't help but think about Mrs. Anderson. About the pain she must have carried for so long, and the desperation that drove her to such extremes. I think about how a simple act of neighborly kindness twisted into something dark and frightening. And I wonder, as I watch a new family move into Mrs. Anderson's old house, their children laughing as they explore their new home, how well do we ever really know our neighbors? What secrets lie behind those friendly smiles and waves? And how do we balance openness and caution in a world where the greatest dangers might be hiding in plain sight, just on the other side of a white picket fence? The sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows across our lawn. I stand up, take one last look at Mrs. Anderson's old house, and go inside. As I lock the door behind me, I say a silent prayer for Mrs. Anderson, for my family, and for all the lonely souls out there searching for connection in all the wrong ways. Because in the end, the scariest monsters aren't the ones that hide under our beds or in our closets. They're the ones that live next door, smile, wave, and offer us cookies, all while plotting to destroy the very thing they so desperately crave. The chairlift jerked to a halt, leaving us dangling over the abyss. As the icy wind whipped around us, I realized our dream ski vacation had just become a nightmare. It was supposed to be the perfect family getaway. My wife, Karen, and our two kids, Ethan, 14, and Lily, 10, had been looking forward to this trip to Aspen for months. I'd splurged on a fancy ski resort, determined to make up for all the weekends I'd missed due to work. The first couple of days were great. The slopes were pristine, the hot chocolate was rich, and the laughter of my family echoed through our cozy chalet. But on the third day, things started to go wrong. It began with little things. Ethan's ski bindings mysteriously came loose during a run, sending him tumbling. Lily's brand new goggles disappeared from our locker. Karen's favorite gloves went missing. Must be gremlins, I joked, trying to lighten the mood, but Karen's expression told me she wasn't amused. That night, as we sat around the fireplace in the resort's grand lobby, I overheard a heated conversation between two staff members. "It's happening again," one whispered urgently. "Just like last season." "Shoo," the other hissed, glancing nervously around the room. Their eyes met mine, and they quickly dispersed. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. What was happening again? And why did they look so scared? The next morning, we decided to try a new trail. As we approached the chairlift, I noticed the operator looked tense, his eyes darting back and forth. "Everything okay?" I asked as we prepared to board. He plastered on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, sir. Enjoy your ride." We were about halfway up the mountain when the lift shuddered to a stop. At first, we thought it was just a momentary pause. These things happen, right? But as minutes ticked by, a sense of unease settled over us. "Dad, I'm cold," Lily whimpered, huddling closer to Karen. "It's okay, sweetie," I reassured her, even as doubt gnawed at my gut. "They'll get us moving soon." But they didn't. The wind picked up, howling around us like a hungry beast. Snow began to fall, thick flakes obscuring our view of the resort below. After what felt like hours, a crackle came from the speakers attached to the lift tower. "Attention passengers," a voice announced, tension evident even through the static. "We are experiencing technical difficulties. Please remain calm. Our team is working to resolve the issue." "Technical difficulties?" Ethan scoffed. "More like someone's messing with us." I wanted to dismiss his comment, but after the strange occurrences of the past few days, I wasn't so sure. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted. We huddled together, sharing what little warmth we could. Lily had long since stopped complaining, her silence more worrying than her earlier whimpers. Suddenly, a scream pierced the night, coming from further up the mountain. Karen grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in painfully. "What was that?" she whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. Before I could respond, we heard it again, a horrifying shriek that seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks. It was followed by a series of loud cracks and a rumbling that shook our lift chair. Avalanche, I breathed, my heart racing. But it didn't sound quite right. The rumbling was too rhythmic, almost like footsteps. A massive shape loomed out of the darkness, moving with impossible speed for its size. It was vaguely humanoid but grotesquely misshapen, with limbs that seemed too long and a head that was little more than a gaping maw. As it passed beneath us, I caught a glimpse of its eyes, cold, dead things that nonetheless burned with malevolent intelligence. It was carrying something. A limp form that I realized with horror was a person. "Oh my God," Karen gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. The creature paused, its head swiveling in our direction. For a heart-stopping moment, I was sure it had heard us. But then it continued on, disappearing into the swirling snow. "Dad," Ethan's voice quavered, all teenage bravado gone. "What the hell was that?" I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. It was impossible. And yet, the lift jerked back to life so suddenly that we nearly fell out. As we descended, I saw figures moving rapidly on the slopes below, their headlamps cutting through the darkness. When we reached the bottom, a group of grim-faced resort staff was waiting. They hurried us inside, their eyes darting nervously to the mountain looming behind us. The lobby was chaos. Guests were demanding answers, children were crying, and the staff looked overwhelmed. I managed to pull aside one of the employees I recognized from earlier. "What's going on?" I demanded. "What was that thing up there?" He paled, glancing around before leaning in close. "You saw it," he whispered. When I nodded, he cursed under his breath. "They said it was just a story, a legend to scare the tourists. But it's real. The Wendigo is real." Karen overheard and interjected, her voice trembling. "Wendigo? Like the Native American myth?" The employee nodded solemnly. "This resort, it was built on sacred land. The elders warned us, but the owners didn't listen. And now it's awake. And it's hungry." A commotion near the front desk drew our attention. A distraught couple was pleading with the manager. "Please, you have to help us find her," the woman sobbed. "Our daughter, she's missing." My blood ran cold as I remembered the limp form in the creature's arms. The manager tried to calm them down, spouting reassurances about search parties and bad cell reception, but I saw the fear in his eyes. He knew. As the night wore on, more reports of missing guests trickled in. The staff grew increasingly frantic, huddling in corners and whispering urgently. I overheard snippets about containing the situation and calling in the experts. I gathered my family close, grateful beyond words that we were all safe. But the terror of what we'd witnessed hung over us like a shroud. Around midnight, a group of stern-looking men in dark suits arrived. They conferred briefly with the manager before addressing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," one of them announced, his voice carrying an air of authority, "due to unforeseen circumstances, we are evacuating the resort. Buses will arrive shortly to transport you to a safe location. Please gather your belongings and prepare to depart." A ripple of confusion and fear swept through the room. Evacuating in the middle of the night? During a snowstorm? As we packed our things, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were fleeing from something far worse than bad weather. The image of that monstrous shape on the mountain haunted me, its hunger palpable even from a distance. The bus ride down the mountain was tense and silent. Lily had finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleeping fitfully in Karen's arms. Ethan stared out the window, his face pale and drawn. Just as we reached the base of the mountain, a bone-chilling howl echoed through the night. The bus driver accelerated, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. We were housed in a nearby town, the authorities citing an environmental hazard at the resort. But I saw the way they looked at us, the survivors. They knew we'd seen something we shouldn't have. In the days that followed, news reports trickled in. The resort was closed indefinitely. Search parties combed the mountain but found no trace of the missing guests. Experts were flown in to assess the situation, but late at night, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still hear it, that terrible, hungry cry echoing across the peaks. And I know that somewhere up there, in the pristine snow and soaring pines, an ancient evil has awakened. An evil that no amount of luxury amenities or corporate cover-ups can contain. We never went skiing again after that. The mountains, once a source of exhilaration and beauty, now loom in my nightmares as dark sentinels hiding unimaginable horrors. And every winter, when the first snow falls, I find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a misshapen shadow in those cold, dead eyes watching, waiting, hungry. The old house creaked and groaned, but it wasn't the pipes that kept me awake that night, it was the woman in the basement. Her eyes were wild, and her words even wilder. I'd been an emergency plumber for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen it all: burst pipes, flooded basements, even the occasional snake in a toilet. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered at 13113 Mockingbird Lane. It was a Tuesday night, just past 1 a.m., when I got the call. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, giving me the address and a brief description of the problem: leak in the basement. Urgent situation. I sighed, grabbed my toolbox, and headed out into the night. The house loomed before me, a Victorian monstrosity that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. Paint peeled from the siding in long, curling strips, and the porch steps groaned ominously under my feet. I hesitated for a moment before knocking, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Just as I was about to call it in as a no-show, the door creaked open of its own accord. Hello? I called out, peering into the dimly lit foyer. Emergency plumber. Anyone home? Silence greeted me, broken only by the steady drip, drip, drip of water from somewhere deep within the house. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The interior was a mess of faded wallpaper and dusty antiques. A single bulb flickered weakly in the hallway, casting long shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The dripping sound grew louder as I made my way toward what I assumed was the basement door. As I reached for the handle, a voice drifted up from below, so faint I almost missed it. Down here, it whispered, sending a shiver through me. Please help me. I hesitated, my hand hovering inches from the door. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get out of this house and never look back. But I was here to do a job, and someone clearly needed help. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and descended into the darkness. The basement was a cavern of shadows, lit only by the weak beam of my flashlight. Water glistened on the concrete floor, reflecting the light in eerie patterns. And there, huddled in the far corner, was a woman. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with wild gray hair and eyes that seemed too large for her face. Her clothes were soaked, clinging to her thin frame like a second skin. As my light fell on her, she blinked rapidly, like a creature unused to illumination. Ma'am, I said, approaching cautiously. I'm here about the leak. Are you all right? She didn't answer directly, just kept muttering under her breath, her eyes darting around the room as if following invisible movements. As I got closer, I could make out some of her words. They're coming. The walls are too thin. Can't keep them out much longer. A chill ran down my spine. This was way above my pay grade. I needed to fix the leak and get out of here fast. I spotted the source of the problem quickly enough, a rusted pipe near the ceiling, water spraying in a fine mist. As I set to work, the woman's muttering grew louder, more frantic. You don't understand, she said suddenly, her voice clear. The water isn't the problem. It's what's in the water. I tried to focus on my task, but her words wormed their way into my mind. What do you mean, ma'am? She crawled closer, her movements jerky and unnatural. They used the pipes, you see. To get in. To whisper their secrets. But I've been listening. Oh yes, I've been listening for years. My hand shook as I tightened the last bolt. The leak slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. In the sudden silence, the woman's breathing seemed unnaturally loud. There, I said, forcing a smile. All fixed. Now, is there someone I can call for you? Family, maybe? She laughed, a high, brittle sound that set my teeth on edge. Family? Oh no, dear boy. They're long gone. Taken, you see. But I outsmarted them. I'm the only one left. I backed away slowly, my toolbox clutched to my chest like a shield. Right. Well, if you're sure you're okay, I'll just be going then. As I turned to leave, her hand shot out, gripping my ankle with surprising strength. Wait, she cried. You have to listen. You have to understand. I tried to pull away, but her grip was like iron. Let go, ma'am. Please. Her eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I saw something in their depths that turned my blood to ice. It wasn't madness I saw there, or at least not just madness. It was knowledge. Terrible, burdensome knowledge that no human was meant to possess. They're in the pipes, she whispered, her voice taking on a sing-song quality. In the walls. In the very air we breathe. Watching. Waiting. And now that you've fixed the leak, you've opened the door for them. A low rumble filled the air, like distant thunder. But the sky had been clear when I arrived. The woman's grip tightened, her nails digging into my skin. Do you hear them? She asked, a manic grin spreading across her face. They're coming. And this time, they're coming for you. With a burst of panic-fueled strength, I wrenched my leg free and bolted for the stairs. Behind me, the woman's laughter echoed off the damp walls, rising to a hysterical pitch. I took the steps 2 at a time, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the top, a gust of wind slammed the basement door shut, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for the handle, my fingers slipping on the smooth metal. The rumbling grew louder, and I swore I could hear voices in it now, countless whispers layered over each other, speaking in languages I couldn't understand but that filled me with a primal dread. Finally, the door gave way, and I stumbled into the hallway. I didn't stop running until I was out of the house and in my truck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I peeled away from the curb, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The woman stood in the doorway, her pale face gleaming in the moonlight. And behind her, in the windows of the upper floors, I saw shapes moving, fluid, impossible shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. I drove through the night, not stopping until I was miles away and the sun was peeking over the horizon. Only then did I pull over and try to make sense of what had happened. The logical part of my brain tried to rationalize it all away. The woman was clearly disturbed, and the rest was just my imagination running wild in a creepy old house. But deep down, I knew better. I had glimpsed something that night, something ancient and alien and utterly terrifying. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Water made me nervous, every dripping faucet, every puddle on the street seemed to hide unspeakable horrors. I started taking showers instead of baths and never lingered long under the spray. I considered quitting my job, but the thought of someone else encountering what I had, someone unprepared, kept me at it. I became known as the guy you called for the weird jobs, the ones in the old houses that other plumbers avoided. And every time I work on a pipe or fix a leak, I listen carefully, not just for the normal sounds of water and metal, but for something else. For whispers. For the rumble of something stirring in the depths. Because now I know the truth. The woman in the basement tried to warn me. The pipes aren't just for water. They're conduits for things we were never meant to encounter. And somewhere out there, in the vast network of pipes and sewers that runs beneath our feet, those things are waiting. Watching. And one day, they'll find their way in. The forest had eyes, and they were all fixed on me. What started as a peaceful solo hike turned into a desperate fight for survival against an unseen predator. I've always been an outdoors enthusiast. There's something about the solitude of nature that recharges my soul like nothing else. So when I had a few days off work, I decided to tackle a challenging trail in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. The morning I set out was perfect, crisp autumn air, a light mist hanging over the trees, and the promise of adventure ahead. I parked my car at the trailhead, double-checked my backpack, and set off into the woods with a spring in my step. The first few hours were everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound through ancient forests, the towering trees creating a cathedral-like canopy above me. I stopped occasionally to take photos or consult my map, reveling in the peaceful solitude. It wasn't until early afternoon that I first felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I whirled around, half expecting to see another hiker, but the trail behind me was empty. The forest was still and silent. I shook off the feeling and pressed on, but it lingered, growing stronger with each passing mile. The woods seemed to close in around me, the shadows deepening despite the midday sun. More than once, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing when I turned to look. As the afternoon wore on, my unease grew. The forest was unnervingly quiet, no bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just the crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. I stopped to rest at a small clearing, dropping my pack and taking a long drink from my water bottle. As I sat there, catching my breath, I became aware of something unusual. The trees around the clearing were marked deep, deliberate gouges that formed patterns I didn't recognize. They weren't random, like the work of animals. They seemed purposeful. A chill ran down my spine. I'd hiked in plenty of remote areas, but I'd never seen anything like this. The thought that someone or something had left those marks unsettled me. I decided to move on, quickening my pace and sticking to the trail. By the time the sun began to set, I was thoroughly spooked. The feeling of being watched had intensified to the point that I could barely think straight. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, and every rustle in the trees made my heart leap into my throat. I reached a small campsite as dusk fell and decided to stop for the night. I pitched my tent quickly, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the poles. After lighting a small fire, I sat close to it, the flickering flames providing a semblance of security. But the sense of being watched never left me. I kept glancing into the darkness beyond the firelight, half expecting to see eyes staring back. I thought about turning back in the morning, abandoning the rest of the hike, but part of me felt stubborn. I didn't want to let fear ruin my trip. That was when I heard it, a low, guttural growl, so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. I froze, straining to hear over the crackling of the fire. The growl came again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam of light revealed nothing but dense foliage. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" The only response was silence. I backed toward my tent, keeping the flashlight trained on the woods. As I reached the flap, something moved, a shadow darting between the trees, too fast for me to see clearly. My heart pounded as I ducked into the tent, zipping it shut and fumbling for my knife. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I sat there in the dark, every nerve on edge, listening for any sound that might give away the presence of whatever or whoever was out there. The growls came intermittently throughout the night, always faint and just far enough away to keep me guessing. I barely slept, jumping at every noise, my knife clutched tightly in my hand. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from the tent, exhausted but relieved to see the first light of day. The forest looked less menacing in the sunlight, but the memory of the night before kept my nerves on edge. As I packed up camp, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The ground around my tent was marked with footprints, large, bare, and distinctly human. They circled my tent, leading to and from the trees in a chaotic, overlapping pattern. Whoever had made those prints had been close. Very close. I decided then and there to abandon the hike and head back to the trailhead. I kept my knife in hand as I walked, my head on a swivel, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, but I forced myself to focus on putting one foot in front of the other. Hours passed, and the trail seemed unfamiliar despite having come this way before. My map didn't match what I was seeing, and I began to suspect I'd gotten turned around. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized I might be lost. That's when I saw it, a figure standing on the trail ahead, half hidden in the shadows. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. Its head tilted as if studying me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of malevolence radiating from it. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, but its presence was enough to send a jolt of terror through me. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes fixed on it. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and inhuman. My instincts took over, and I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, heedless of the noise I was making. Branches tore at my clothes and scratched my face, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting into unnatural shapes. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were on fire, only stopping when I stumbled into another clearing. Gasping for breath, I looked around. The clearing was eerily similar to the one where I'd stopped the day before, complete with the same strange markings on the trees. I realized with a sinking feeling that I hadn't escaped. I was right back where I'd started. A low growl echoed from the woods, followed by the sound of branches snapping. Whatever was out there, it was closing in. I gripped my knife tightly, my back to a tree, and waited for the inevitable. The growling grew louder, a guttural, resonant sound that seemed to come from all directions. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scanned the treeline, knife in hand, ready to face whatever was coming. But nothing could have prepared me for what stepped into the clearing. It was the figure I had seen earlier, tall, emaciated, and horribly wrong. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, and its skin was pale and stretched tightly over its skeletal frame. The head was misshapen, with hollow, sunken eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. It let out a guttural hiss as it moved toward me, each step slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the hunt. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My body was frozen in place, rooted to the spot by pure terror. The creature stopped a few feet away, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. Its head tilted as if studying me, and I swear I heard it whisper something, words in a language I couldn't understand but that seemed to burrow into my mind like a parasite. Desperation finally broke through the paralysis, and I lashed out with the knife. The blade sliced through the air, but the creature moved impossibly fast, dodging my attack with ease. It let out a sound that might have been laughter, a deep, rattling noise that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The creature loomed over me, its skeletal fingers reaching out. I scrambled away, kicking and swinging the knife wildly, but it was no use. It was toying with me, letting me exhaust myself before it struck. In my panic, my hand brushed against something cold and metallic, a flare gun I had packed for emergencies. I grabbed it, aimed shakily at the creature, and pulled the trigger. The flare exploded in a burst of blinding light and heat, striking the creature square in the chest. It let out a piercing shriek, the sound so loud and otherworldly that it felt like it would split my skull. The creature staggered backward, its pale skin bubbling and blackening where the flare had hit. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I got to my feet and ran. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in tighter and tighter as I pushed forward. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare stop. Behind me, I could hear the creature's pained cries fading into the distance, but I knew better than to assume I was safe. When I finally burst onto the trailhead, my car was still there, a beacon of salvation in the gathering darkness. I didn't stop running until I was inside, slamming the door and locking it behind me. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, and the engine roared to life on the third try. I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. It wasn't until I reached the main highway, the lights of passing cars illuminating the night, that I finally allowed myself to believe I had escaped. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I told myself it was some kind of hallucination, stress, dehydration, maybe even a gas leak from an old pipeline. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something lives in those woods. Something ancient, malevolent, and intelligent. It hunts not for food, but for sport, for the sheer pleasure of instilling terror in its prey. And I had narrowly escaped being its next victim. I haven't set foot in the forest since that day. The thought of being surrounded by trees, of hearing the rustle of leaves in the wind, fills me with a deep, primal fear. My gear sits untouched in the corner of my garage, gathering dust. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about the creature. I see its glowing eyes, its impossibly long limbs, and I hear its whispered words, still incomprehensible, but no less chilling. I wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, and for a moment, I'm back in that clearing, facing the embodiment of my worst nightmare. But the worst part isn't the dreams. It's the feeling that I brought something back with me. That somehow, when I fired that flare, I made an enemy of whatever lurks in those woods. And that one day, when I least expect it, it will come for me. The doorbell rang at 3 a.m., shattering the silence of the night. Half asleep, I stumbled to the door, annoyed and a little uneasy. No one ever came by at this hour. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. Confused, I flicked on the porch light and cautiously opened the door a crack. A small package sat on the welcome mat, unmarked and wrapped in plain brown paper. Something about it felt wrong. I looked up and down the street, searching for any sign of movement, but the neighborhood was eerily still. The cold night air bit at my skin, urging me to retreat inside, but curiosity won out. I picked up the package and brought it into the kitchen. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. There was no return address, no postage stamp, just my name scrawled on the top in neat, blocky letters. My heart thudded in my chest as I grabbed a knife and carefully slit the paper open. Inside was an old VHS tape. I stared at it, confused. Who still used VHS tapes? I didn't even own a VCR anymore. On the label, written in the same neat handwriting as my name, were 2 words, "Watch-a-me." The unease that had been gnawing at me since the doorbell rang now blossomed into full-blown dread. This had to be a prank, I told myself. Some sick joke from a bored neighbor or a friend with a twisted sense of humor. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The tape sat on my counter for hours while I debated what to do. Every time I looked at it, I felt an almost magnetic pull, as if it were daring me to find out what secrets it held. Finally, as dawn broke, I made a decision. I had to know. A quick trip to a thrift store yielded a dusty old VCR for $10. I brought it home, hooked it up to my TV, and slid the tape inside. The machine whirred to life, the screen flickering with static before settling on an image. At first, it was just darkness. Then, slowly, the scene came into focus. It was a grainy, black and white video of a room, my living room. My stomach dropped as I recognized the couch, the coffee table, even the crooked picture frame on the wall. The timestamp in the corner showed 2:47 a.m., barely 15 minutes before the doorbell had rung. The camera was stationary, positioned in a corner of the ceiling. I didn't have any security cameras in my house, and the realization that someone had set this up without my knowledge sent a wave of nausea through me. The video played on, uneventful at first. Then, at exactly 2:55 a.m., the front door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, a tall, thin man wearing a dark hoodie that obscured his face. He moved with eerie precision, his steps silent as he approached the couch. I watched, paralyzed, as the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a tape, identical to the one now playing in my VCR. He placed it on the coffee table, straightened up, and turned to face the camera. For the first time, I saw his face, or rather, the lack of one. His features were completely smooth, like a mannequin or a wax figure that hadn't been finished. Where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been was nothing but blank, pale skin. My breath caught in my throat as the figure tilted its head, as if studying me through the screen. Then it raised a hand and pointed directly at the camera, at me. The screen went black. I ejected the tape, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. My mind raced. Who or what had been in my house? How had they gotten in? And what did they want? The rational part of me screamed to call the police, but a deeper, more primal instinct told me they wouldn't be able to help. This wasn't something that could be explained by breaking and entering or security footage. This was something else entirely. I spent the rest of the day checking every door, every window, every possible point of entry into my house. Nothing was out of place, no locks were broken, and yet the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside made my heart race. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke the next morning, there was another package on my doorstep. This one was larger, wrapped in the same plain brown paper. My name was scrawled on the top again, but this time, the handwriting looked shaky, almost frantic. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, to burn it, to throw it in the trash and never think about it again. But curiosity and fear are powerful motivators. Inside was a stack of photographs. They were all of me, taken from angles that suggested whoever had taken them had been watching me for weeks, maybe months. There were pictures of me at work, at the grocery store, in my living room, even sleeping in my bed. Each one was dated and timestamped, meticulously cataloging my daily life. At the bottom of the stack was a single handwritten note: "This is only the beginning. I don't know what they want or why they chose me. I don't know if it's a person, a group, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing: they're not done." Every night, I sit in the dark, listening for the sound of the doorbell. Every morning, I check the porch, half expecting to find another package waiting for me. And every time I close my eyes, I see that faceless figure, pointing at me through the screen, as if to say, "You're next." I've considered leaving, starting over in a new city, a new state, maybe even a new country. But deep down, I know it won't matter. You can't run from something like this. You can't escape the kind of fear that comes from knowing someone or something is watching your every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. Because the truth is, I'm not just being watched. I'm being hunted. And sooner or later, they'll come for me. The house was supposed to be a fresh start, a new beginning for me and my daughter, Alice. But from the moment we moved in, it felt wrong, like the walls were watching us. The property had been a steal. A beautiful Victorian home on the edge of a small town, with a wraparound porch and a sprawling backyard. It needed some work, sure, but I was handy enough. It seemed like the perfect place to rebuild our lives after the divorce. Alice loved it at first. She spent hours exploring the creaky old house, her laughter echoing through the empty rooms. But within a week, that laughter turned into silence. She became withdrawn, her usual spark dimmed. "Is everything okay, sweetheart?" I asked one evening as we unpacked boxes in the living room. She hesitated, her small hands fidgeting with the edge of a blanket. "I don't like my room, Daddy." I frowned. "Why not?" "You picked it out yourself." She didn't look at me. "The girl in the closet doesn't want me there." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "The girl in the closet?" I repeated, forcing a calm tone. Alice nodded solemnly. "She says it's her room. She wants us to leave." I chalked it up to her imagination. Moving was stressful, and it wasn't unusual for kids to create imaginary friends to cope. Still, I checked her closet that night just to be sure. It was empty, of course, but the air inside felt colder than the rest of the room. That night, I heard Alice talking softly in her room. When I peeked in, she was sitting on the edge of her bed, facing the open closet door. Her voice was low, almost conversational, but there was no one there. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" I asked, stepping inside. She turned to me, her eyes wide and serious. "The girl." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What's her name?" Alice tilted her head as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "Margaret," she said after a moment. Over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen. Doors would creak open on their own. Objects would move from where I'd left them. At first, I blamed the wind or my own forgetfulness, but the incidents grew harder to dismiss. One morning, I found Alice's drawings scattered across the kitchen table. They were crude, childlike sketches of a girl with long black hair and hollow eyes. In each drawing, the girl stood in the shadows of a room, watching. "Did you draw these?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Alice nodded. "Margaret asked me to." The unease that had been simmering since we moved in boiled over that night. I woke to the sound of whispers, faint but distinct, coming from Alice's room. When I opened her door, she was standing in the middle of the room, her face pale and her eyes unfocused. "Alice?" I called softly. She didn't respond. She just pointed to the closet. The door was wide open, and the darkness inside seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. I grabbed her and pulled her into my arms, slamming the closet door shut. "There's nothing there," I said, more to myself than to her. "It's just an old house with creaky floors and noisy pipes." But deep down, I didn't believe that. I decided to do some research on the house. A trip to the local library turned up a newspaper article from decades ago. The headline read, "Local Girl Found Dead in Family Home." The article detailed the story of Margaret Bell, a 10-year-old girl who had lived in the house in the 1950s. She had disappeared one night, and her body was found days later, hidden in the very closet Alice now called hers. The cause of death was never determined, and the case remained unsolved. I felt sick as I read the article. Was Alice's imaginary friend somehow connected to Margaret? Was her spirit still trapped in the house? That night, I confronted Alice about Margaret. "What does she want, sweetheart?" I asked gently. Alice looked at me, her eyes full of fear. "She says she's lonely. She wants me to stay with her." My stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" Alice didn't answer. She just hugged me tightly and whispered, "Don't let her take me, Daddy." I decided we couldn't stay in the house any longer. The next morning, I packed up what I could and made arrangements to leave. But as I was loading the car, Alice disappeared. Panic gripped me as I searched the house, calling her name. When I reached her room, the closet door was open again, and the air was icy cold. I stepped inside, the darkness swallowing me whole. "Alice?" I called, my voice trembling. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into complete darkness. The temperature dropped further, my breath visible in the faint light filtering through the slats of the door. And then I heard it, a soft, childlike giggle, followed by a whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "She's mine now." I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was outside, clutching Alice tightly in my arms. Her face was pale, her body limp, but she was breathing. We left that house and never looked back. I sold it as quickly as I could, refusing to go inside again. But the experience left scars on both of us. Alice still refuses to talk about what happened, and I can't say I blame her. But sometimes, late at night, I hear her whispering in her sleep, her voice low and fearful. And once, just once, I heard a second voice, soft, childlike, and full of malice, answer her. The subway car rattled and groaned as it sped through the dark tunnel. I was the only passenger, or so I thought. The clock on my phone read 2:34 a.m., and the city felt as though it had gone to sleep. I had taken the late train many times before, but this time, something felt different. The lights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows on the worn seats. The usual hum of the train seemed off, like a faint whisper layered beneath the mechanical drone. I brushed it off as exhaustion after a long day at work, leaning back and closing my eyes. Then I heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible over the train's noise. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against metal. My eyes snapped open, scanning the car. It was empty, just as it had been when I boarded. Tap. 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 The sound grew louder, coming from the far end of the car. I squinted through the dim light, and that's when I saw her. A woman stood at the far door, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her long, dark hair hung limply over her shoulders, obscuring most of her face. She was barefoot, wearing a tattered white dress that looked like it had seen decades of wear. "Hello?" I called hesitantly, my voice wavering. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond. Instead, she took a step closer, her bare feet making no sound against the floor. The tapping continued, though I realized with a jolt that it wasn't coming from her feet. It was coming from her fingers, which were dragging along the metal pole as she moved forward. "Do you need help?" I asked, my throat dry. She stopped abruptly, her head snapping upright. I caught a glimpse of her face, and my breath hitched. Her features were sunken, her skin pallid and almost translucent. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to pierce right through me. The train lurched suddenly, and the lights flickered again. When they stabilized, she was closer, much closer. I hadn't seen her move. She stood just a few feet away now, her head tilted again, her unblinking eyes fixed on mine. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, gripping the seat for support. Her lips parted, and a faint, raspy voice escaped. "This is my train."